Salvete discipuli, hodie spectatis lecturam quintam capitis viginti quinque, Infinitives and Indirect Statement. Hodie discemus primum vocabula capitis viginti quinque, deinde grammaticam. We'll learn infinitives, all the different infinitives, in the active voice, the present infinitive, the perfect infinitive, and the future active infinitive. And then passive infinitives. We'll review the present passive infinitive, as well as the perfect passive infinitive and future passive infinitive. And we'll need all those infinitives because we'll then learn indirect statement, otherwise known as indirect discourse. Primum discemus verba vocabulorum capitis viginti quinque. In hoc capite sunt decem verba: ait, credo, iaceo, nego, nescio, nuntio, patefacio, poto, spero, suscipio. Primum verbum: ait, aiunt. Cognosce te ipsum, ait oraculum Apollinis Delphis, gnothis auton in lingua Graeca. Quid significat ait? Proximum verbum: credo, credere, credidi, creditum. In civitatibus foederatis multi Bibliae ad litteram credunt. Credunt igitur mundum septem diebus ad Deo factum esse. Quid significat credo? Proximum verbum: iaceo, iacere, iacui. Mihi imaginem photographicam felis in terra iacentis capturo, in ventre quoque iacendum erat. Quid significat iaceo? Ecce felis, ecce ego ipse, nos iacemus. Quid significat? Proximum verbum: nego, negare, negavi, negatum. In judicio Socrates negavit se juventutem Atheniensem corrupisse. Quid significat nego? Proximum verbum: nescio, nesciere, nescivi, nescitum. Scio me nihil scire, inquit Socrates. Sapientia vera est scire nos nescire. Quid significat nescio? Proximum verbum: nuntio, nuntiare, nuntiavi, nuntiatum. Fidipides marathone Athenas magna cum celeritate cucurit, et nuntiavit Athenienses persas vicisse. Quid significat nuntio? Proximum verbum: patefacio, patefacere, patefeci, patefactum. In senatu Cicero patefecit Catilinam cum coniuratis bellum in rem publicam gestorum esse. Quid significat patefacio? Ecce Cicero, ecce Catilina. Cicero patefecit Catilina bellum in rem publicam gestorum esse. Proximum verbum: puto, putare, putavi, putatum. Quantas fabas saccarinas hac in olla contineri putatis? Quid significat puto? Ecce olla, ecce plurimae fabae saccarinae. Proximum verbum. Spero, sperare, speravi, speratum. Vita est, ubi spes est. Dum spero, spero. Quid significat spero? Ultimum verbum. Suscipio, suscipere, suscepi, susceptum. Terminator sarcophagum suscipit. Quid significat suscipio? Nunc discemus nomina vocabulorum capitis viginti quinque. In hoc capite est una sola nomen, or unum solum nomen, lingua. Primum et ultimum nomen, lingua linguae. Cognosce te ipsum ait oraculum Apollinis Delphis, gnothis auton in lingua Graeca. Quid significat lingua? Nunc discemus adjectiva vocabulorum capitis viginti quinque. In hoc capita sunt quinque adjectiva: ferox, fidelis, geminus, sapiens, ultimus. Primum adjectivum: ferox. Horatius scripsit: victorem ferocem a Graecia capta captum esse. Quid significat ferox? Proximum adjectivum: fidelis, fidele. Milites qui semper fidelis aiunt, fidem in summa aestimatione habent. Quid significat fidelis? Proximum adjectivum: geminus, gemina, geminum. Ecce constellatio geminorum. Ecce signum zodiacum Gemini. Quid significat geminus? Gemini castor et pollux. Castor et pollux sunt Gemini. Quid significat? Proximum adjectivum: sapiens. In scientia moderna homo sapiens species humana appellator. Creditis ne homines cum veritate tam sapientes esse? Nunc discemus alias partes loquendi vocabulorum capitis viginti quinque. In hoc capita sunt duo adverbia: dehinc, hic, or hic. Primum adverbium: dehinc. Primum cinabo: dehinc dormiam, inquit feles. Quid significat dehinc? Ultimum adverbium: hic. Hic sine macrone, hic homo. Hic cum macrone, hoc in loco significat. Quid significat hic? Okay, so in this chapter we are learning all of the different infinitives we have in Latin. Just a reminder of what form an infinitive is. An infinitive is a form of a verb, right? It denotes an action conceived in the abstract, i.e. the idea of an action. So the idea of sleeping, okay? The idea of eating, the idea of making, etc., okay? Now an infinitive is called an infinitive because it doesn't have limits. It is not bound by person, number, or mood, right? It is not a finite verb, okay? It's infinite. However, even though it is not bound by these three things, it can still have different tenses and voices. In other words, you can still express the idea of an action happening in the past, present, or future, either being performed by a subject or the subject receiving it. Okay, that can still be expressed in the abstract. Okay, which is why you can still have tense and voice of infinitives. Okay, so infinitives in English can be expressed this way, right? With the preposition to in English, with the verb and various helping verbs and whatnot to express tense and voice. So the present active infinitive to receive, the present passive infinitive in English would be to have. The perfect infinitive, the past tense infinitive active in English would be to have received, or the future active infinitive in English to be about to receive. And then in the passive, if we have the equivalent of the present passive infinitive would translate to be received, the perfect passive infinitive to have been received, and the future passive infinitive to be about to be received, etc. Right? Okay, so let's go through what they look like in Latin. Okay, so let's start with present infinitives. Okay, present active and present passive infinitives. So to x or to be x, to verb or to be verbed. That is the question, right? And again, these are the infinitives that we know and love, especially the active ones. They are taken from the second principal part. Okay, so the present active infinitive is the second principal part of any verb. Okay, so here are 5 examples of all the verb conjugations, including third IO there, right? So that's the vowel RE endings, okay? We also learned in a previous chapter that we can have a present passive infinitive. In other words, instead of to love, it's to be loved. Instead of to hold, to be held, to lead, to be led, to capture, to be captured, to hear, to be heard, right? And for that, for all except the third conjugation, we just cut off the E at the end and add a long I. For the third conjugation, we cut off the whole ERE and add a long I. Okay? So this is a review of that. Okay? And so these will be useful. But there is also the perfect active infinitive. You can express the idea of an action in the past. So to have verbed. Okay? And to form that, you take the third principal part, which we use for the perfect system, you cut off the I, and you add issa, I-S-S-E, okay? So you get amawissa, to have loved, tenuissa, to have held, duxissa, to have led, capissa, to have taken, audiwissa, to have heard, okay? There's also the perfect passive infinitive, to have been verbed, okay? And just as with forming the perfect passive finite verbs, the perfect passive infinitive is just the perfect passive participle plus essa, which is the infinitive of the verb to be. That makes sense, right? Your helping verb to be would be in the infinitive of this construction, right? So here's what it looks like. So the perfect passive infinitive, and sorry, that should not say active there, mea culpa, is just the perfect passive participle plus essa. So amatus, amata, amatum, essa, okay, means to have been loved. Tentus, tenta, tentum essa, to have been held. Ductus, ducta, ductum essa, to have been led. Auditus, audita, auditum essa, to have been heard. And notice here that when you use the perfect passive infinitive in context, you actually still have to change or modify the ending of the perfect passive participle part of it to match the subject in gender, case, and number, okay, even as an infinitive, okay? Also, there's the future active infinitive, okay, to be about to verb, right? And for this, it's similar to how you form the previous thing. You take the future active participle and then add the infinitive of to be as your helping verb, okay? So, amatorus, amatorum, amatora, amatorum essa, to be about to love, okay, etc., etc. here, okay? So, as you see, what we've been building toward is you now have been learning participles, and now this is useful for forming these infinitives, okay? Finally, there's the future passive infinitive, to be about to be verbed. This is a weird one, and it's not used very commonly in Latin, okay? But it's actually pretty simple to form. Just take the fourth principal part and then add iri, okay, which is technically the present passive of the verb to go. Okay, so amatum iri is something like literally to be about to go be verbed or something like that. The amatum there is sort of it's kind of being used as a supine, but this is getting into very kind of technical discussion. But just fourth principal part plus iri, that's your future passive infinitive. And again, why am I saying that's active? Okay, there we go, fixed it. Okay, so what is the payoff for learning all of these different infinitives? Well, let me introduce you to my mother, Barbara, and her 4 cats. And you'll notice those are all the cats that I've been using in various pictures throughout my lectures. Okay, she's going to help us learn a very important grammatical construction in Latin that is used all the time, and we're going to be seeing for all the time from here on out, called indirect statement, otherwise known as indirect discourse. Okay? And to learn indirect statement, let's talk about what a direct statement is. A direct statement is every kind of sentence we have been dealing with so far. Okay? Barbara loves cats. Okay? A subject, verbs, a direct object. Okay? I love cats. Okay, same idea. We also have direct statements where we have quoted speech. So such as Barbara says, I love cats. Okay, so we have a direct statement of a subject doing a verb, and then that verb introduces a quotation in which a different subject is introduced, okay, et cetera, and I love cats is still a direct statement. So these are 2 direct statements that are sort of paired through the process of quotation. Okay? What about indirect statement? Indirect statement in English looks like this. We all know that Barbara loves cats. I say that I love cats. Okay? Notice the difference between indirect statement and the direct statements above. Okay? Notice that in English, we have essentially 2 statements that are separated by the word that. So we all know is a direct statement that introduces an indirect statement starting with the word that plus whatever the statement is. Okay? And you can see that this is essentially another way of saying that. Okay? Now in Latin, at least in classical Latin, medieval Latin does something closer to what English does, using a quod instead of the word that. But this isn't medieval Latin class, so deal with it. How do indirect statements work in Latin? Well, they involve a lot of infinitives, hence us learning about infinitives in this chapter as well. Okay, so indirect statements do not exist by themselves. They are always set off by a direct statement. Usually that direct statement is set off with a direct statement that contains a head verb. And head verb means a verb that you do with your head. Knowing, thinking, speaking, sensing, saying, affirming, hoping. Okay, any verb that can, in English, set off an indirect statement starting with that, right? Now, a Latin indirect statement is a little bit counterintuitive because the subject of a Latin indirect statement is actually in the accusative case, while the verb that it performs is in the infinitive. Okay, so let's start with a direct statement with quotation. Barbara feles amat. Okay, Barbara loves cats. Feles amo inquit Barbara. Okay, Barbara says, I love cats. Okay, let's look at indirect statement. Okay, omne scimus Barbaram feles amara. Okay, we all know that Barbara loves cats. Barbara dicit se feles amara. Barbara says that she loves cats. Okay, so notice that skimus and dicit are both head verbs. Okay, the verb to know, the verb to say. Okay, and so they are setting off a indirect statement. Okay, and that the subject of the indirect statement, the one doing the verb, is actually in the accusative case, and that the verb that this indirect statement subject is doing is in the infinitive. Okay? It makes sense because we can literally translate this as, we all know Barbara to love cats. Okay? So in a sense, the subject of the indirect statement is the direct object of the head verb. Okay? Barbara says herself to love cats. She states herself to love cats. Okay? So it's not completely arbitrary. Now notice that if a direct statement is introducing an indirect statement with the same subject as the subject of the head verb, then you use a reflexive pronoun. Okay? In this case, a third person reflexive pronoun. Barbara says that she herself, okay, referring back to her, a reflexive pronoun in the accusative, okay, is also doing the indirect statement verb. Okay? If I could say ego dico me feles amare, I say that I love cats. Okay? So any reflexive pronoun depending on what the subject is. Okay? All right. Now let's build upon this, and here's where us learning all of those different tenses and voices of infinitives comes into play. Okay? And if you recall participles, with participles, we learned that the tense of a participle is relational to the tense of the main verb. Well, it's similar in indirect statement. The tense of the infinitive in indirect statement depends on its relation in time to the main verb in direct statement. Okay? So here's what I mean by this. You use a present infinitive in indirect statement to denote simultaneous action with the head verb. Okay? So let's look at this. Livius dicit Romulum Romam regere. Livy says that Romulus is ruling Rome. Okay? So this is a present head verb, and this is a present infinitive. Okay? So this implies that the saying and the ruling are happening at the same time. Livy says that Romulus is ruling Rome. Okay? Also works with a present passive infinitive. Livy says that Rome is being ruled by Romulus. Okay? Again, present infinitive, okay, present head verb, simultaneous action. Okay? What if we put the head verb in the perfect, but kept the infinitives of the indirect statement in the present? Livy said that Romulus was ruling Rome. Livy said that Rome was being ruled by Romulus. Okay? Notice that the tense of the direct statement changed, but because we have present infinitives in the indirect statement, it is still simultaneous action with the verb, with the head verb, regardless of what tense of the head verb it is. Okay? Okay. What if you're using a perfect infinitive in the indirect statement? Okay? A perfect active infinitive like rexissa, or a perfect passive infinitive like rectum esse. Okay? Let's start with this first sentence. Livius dicit Romulum Romam rexissa. Livy says that Romulus ruled Rome, or has ruled Rome, okay, or was ruling Rome, okay? So, and then Livius dicit Romam a Romulo rectam esse. Livy says that Rome was ruled by Romulus, okay? So, we have a present head verb, okay, and we have a perfect indirect statement verb, meaning that this action happened before this action, okay? The ruling happened before the saying. Now, what if the head verb is also in a past tense, like the perfect. What does that mean? It still means that the indirect statement verb happened prior to the head verb. Okay, so Livius dixit Romulum Romam rexissa. Okay, Livius said that Romulus had ruled Rome. Or Livius dixit Romam a Romul rectam esse. Livy said that Rome had been ruled by Romulus. And notice that in English, I'm using a pluperfect, okay, in order to show that this happened prior to this happening. Okay, so again, perfect infinitives in indirect statement for prior action to the verb in direct statement. Okay, you probably know where this is going with the future infinitives. Okay, so present infinitives for simultaneous action, perfect infinitives for prior action, and therefore future infinitives for subsequent actions. Okay, so actions that will happen after the head verb. Okay, Livius dicit Romulum Romam rectorum esse. Livy says that Romulus will rule Rome. Livius dicit Romam a Romulo rectum iri. Livy says that Rome will be ruled by Romulus. Okay, so again, the future infinitives will tell you about a subsequent action to the main verb. Now, what if the main verb, the head verb, the direct statement verb, is in a past tense like the perfect? Livius dixit Romulum Romam rectorum esse. Livius dixit Romam a Romulo rectum esse. Iri. Sorry. Livy said that Romulus would rule Rome. Livy said that Rome would be ruled by Romulus. Okay, so if you have a past tense in English, if you have a past tense head verb and a future infinitive indirect statement verb, then you would use would instead of will, right? Because it's possible that this still happened in the past. Okay, but it still happens subsequent to the main verb. Livy said that Romulus would rule Rome. Livy says that Romulus will rule Rome. Okay, so that's sort of the standard way you translate it into English, but the most important thing is you understand the relationship in time between the infinitives in indirect statement and the head verbs in direct statement. Okay, this was a lot to explain. We'll spend a lot of time with this. And we'll give, and I think it'll be pretty straightforward in practice. Okay, so valete discipuli.